Game over, man. Game over. Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Oh, welcome to this podcast review for April 16th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation where it'll be a war, and I'm not sure how civil it'll be.
Civility, who needs it?
Yeah, who needs that?
I think the burning question is, JD, which one of us is Steve Rogers? Which one is Tony Stark?
I'm Peter Parker in this situation.
So you're a child. You're a child. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. So that's my affiliation here. Yeah, we've already discussed one Civil War some years ago, but we're back for another. And we're not alone. I'm very excited for this conversation. We're joined by our very own Shadan Larki. Shadan, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Hello. What does that make me in this scenario? What am I, like Black Widow?
You're Black Widow.
Who would you like
default.
to be? How about that? We'll leave it up to you.
Well, considering the fact that I saw this film like a month ago and I still don't know where I land on it, I'm probably just like some confused bystander in the background that's like a casualty of war. That's who I am.
Yeah.
That is the best answer anyone could
Honestly,
have provided for this analogy.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that sentiment is going to be regurgitated a couple of times as we go here. We're all bystanders that is getting all the shrapnel from the vitriol and the discourse online.
We're all getting shot at.
We're all just, exactly. We're all bleeding out here from the Civil War discourse. So,
yeah. Oh, this is going to be fun.
We're going to get into it, though. We're going to get into it. Alex Garland back with another movie. And
provocateur. Alex Garland provocateur. Not even auteur. He's a provocateur.
Exactly. And Men was controversial. I don't even know where or how to label this one comparatively. It's in a new stratosphere compared to Men. So...
Oh, gosh. You know, I really hope this actually turns into a civil war between the three of us. Then it helps prove the movie's point.
Maybe. All right. Well, I guess we can go ahead and jump into it. I don't know if we need to really lay the groundwork any further than that. But yes, Civil War, the latest from Alex Garland and A24.
Yeah.
And it stars Kirsten Dunst, Wagner Moura, Kaylee Spaney, Stephen McKinley Henderson, and sort of Nick Offerman.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with Civil War, God bless you, but just in case, it is a journey across a dystopian future America following a team of military-embedded journalists as they race against time to reach D.C. before rebel factions descend upon the White House. All right. Let's go ahead and get right to it. Shadan, we'll start with you. What did you think about Civil War?
As I said, I'm still very torn on this. And I will preface this by saying I'm a huge fan of Alex Garland. Like, love his films. I mean, Men, not so much, but like before that, Annihilation, Ex Machina is one of my favorites. Going back to like Sunshine, like I love anything this man touches.
Yeah.
This, I think the problem for me is that it just didn't emotionally connect. Like I wasn't really, I don't know. Even the beats where I was like, oh, I'm supposed to feel very emotional. I just didn't. And I mean, I've heard a lot of discourse saying like the point of the film is for it to be apolitical, but it just bothered me how apolitical it was. It felt to me like it was very empty and it didn't necessarily have much to say. And even beyond that, I just found the screenplay to be kind of all over the place. Like there was just, and then there were moments of incredible tension, like the Jesse Plemons whole sequence is probably one of the best I've seen in quite some time, but there was a lot of things that just fell flat and it kind of it would lose that tension and then build up again. And then, so it was a wild ride all over the place. I mean, maybe the fact that the discourse is kind of all over the place is the point. And the fact that people are talking about it was probably what Garland wanted in the first place. And I just have to say, like, as somebody who comes from a journalism background, I found a lot of that to just be like inaccurate, and I don't know a lot of journalists that would behave in that way. Even like the Kaylee Spaney character, she's like shooting on film, but we like barely see her like changing the film and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, that doesn't seem like that. And even though she's young, it just seems like she would know to like get out of the way. Like she was endangering a lot of people consistently. So yeah, I'm all over the place. But I mean, cinematography, fantastic. Sound, fantastic. Kristen Dunst, like, never misses. She's phenomenal. So yeah, was that the answer you were looking for, JD?
Yeah, I think
the answer is I don't know. It's
I don't know.
A lot of words to get to I don't know, and that's certainly fair.
Well, but sometimes it's fascinating to be like on that movie's wavelength in this way so early, because it makes the conversation so interesting at this present point. It's certainly one of those movies that maybe we'd have to revisit maybe 2 or 3 years down the road to see what changes, because sociopolitical environments could shape this movie in a certain way. And that could be a fascinating thing. I do think your thoughts there, Shadan, are really interesting, because I feel like most of the opinions on this movie are some variation of the movie's very well made. It's very thrilling. As a movie, it really does work very well. It's really in its messaging that's getting a lot of people up in arms. And I feel like I'm kind of in the opposite end of that spectrum. So I do want to start here. I feel like what Alex Garland is going for, at least what I think he's going for, I think it's a very provocative and interesting idea. Like the notion of presenting the most intense political scenario possible here in the state specifically, and trying to do so in the most neutral way. I like that idea, and funneling it through war journalism. I think it creates this idea that we as media consumers will often project our own beliefs on publications without proper context. So I feel like it's a film that is simultaneously a tribute to war journalists and what they put themselves through, but it might also be asking a question if their efforts are also complicit in fueling our sociopolitical divide, even if they don't realize it. Like, I think that's an interesting idea. It almost presents the camera as just as much a weapon as every assault rifle that we see on screen. So I like that idea. Can't speak to the accuracy from a journalistic standpoint like you can, but I think that idea broadly is pretty interesting. So if that's what the messaging was, or at least what part of it was, I can get on the movie's wavelength in that regard. My problem with the movie, in fact, it's like I think that neutrality is its greatest strength, but my issue is purely how it functions as a movie. And normally I don't like to make loud hyperbolic statements on this show, JD. You know I don't like doing that unless I feel like they are needed. I like to keep things kind of, for lack of a better term, civil, where they need to be. Sure. But given how the divisiveness of this movie has been as hateful as it is, maybe it's okay to be a little bit abrasive here. I just think this movie's bland as hell. I think it is very bland. I think the filmmaking here has no real aesthetic personality whatsoever. I think the artfulness that made Ex Machina and Annihilation so good and so distinct, that's pretty much absent here. And as a war thriller, its thrills felt very paint by numbers to me. There's no shock value, no element of surprise. Even as much as I like the Jesse Plemons bit on paper, mostly because of Jesse Plemons, I think the narrative around that sequence is very derivative. And I think the dialogue itself is laughably pointed at times. In many ways, it kind of feels like a first draft. So I think I can get behind what the film is saying. I just don't think it's a very good movie, if that makes sense. And it makes me think, is if this is the movie everyone's getting up in arms about, I find that kind of silly, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I am in the same position I feel like Shadan is. I honestly don't know what to make of this movie.
Okay.
On one hand, I found the discourse and its focus on the film's apolitical viewpoint to be a little distorted, at least initially, because it's quite evident that Garland made a movie not about politics or a civil war, but about journalists and photographers who commit themselves to the warfare as much as soldiers do. It's a love letter to photojournalism and the human cost related to that line of work. In that context, the absence of politics is perspicuous. And so, in lieu of politics, we get images such as Sammy reaching out to fire embers surrounding him like snowflakes, or Lee laying in the grass admiring gorgeous flowers as a sniper rains down gunfire, or the crew rolling up to a town that blissfully feels normal, concentrating on things like sprinklers glistening in the sun. The film is so dedicated to its characters and who they are as journalists that any political commentary is almost futile, because it's not about which side of the aisle they belong to, but rather their emotional journeys and how they are defined by their work, by their legacies. However, poaching the extreme divisiveness of American politics to examine societal collapse through the cipher of photojournalism, I do think is a bit rash and misguided, because the Civil War itself here is essentially a red herring. The conflict presented in the film is extremely hefty, yet it spends no time in detailing how or why any of this started. The angling of who's against who is murky, because the film refuses to engage with any of its assertions. The group may not indulge in politics, but it's impossible to separate them from the death and carnage around them that is a direct result of political fallout. And I think Garland sets himself up to fail in that regard. It didn't need to pick a side, but at least have the conviction to explore how their work, even if it is objective, how it collides with that political fallout. I think by ignoring that here, its ode to journalism isn't nearly as robust as it could be, and its political premise lacks bite significantly, I think.
Yeah,
So
I'm
there-
with you there. Lacking bite's a great way to put it.
Yeah, there's craft to be admired. The performances are great. There's tension that is thick at times, but I do think that duality between the political angle of the film, or the lack thereof, and what he's wanting to explore here in terms of journalism, those things are inherently tethered together in ways that I certainly want to unpack more as this conversation goes. And I think by keeping them separate, I think that both ends of those spectrum suffer quite
It's
drastically.
like, where's the through line there? And that's what we're having a hard time finding.
Yeah.
Brendan, I think your thoughts are so interesting and you've articulated so well. I think the issue is like, because the screenplay in particular, I mean, the dialogue, I agree, just feels stilted at times. It feels ridiculous. I found myself sort of laughing at times. So I think because that is missing, that's why a lot of those emotional moments just didn't hit for me. And it's interesting, JD said that like a lot the characters, I just didn't find them like particularly well developed. I mean, yeah, Kristen Dunst, like, she's willing to do whatever it takes to get the shot, but like, other than that, I mean, I don't know. I just felt like if you wanted to do an ode to journalism, it should have been sort of deeper in that regard. It kind of felt like kind of what JD was saying. It's like in between these two worlds, and it doesn't, because it's not committed to either one, it doesn't do either one the justice that it deserves. And I think for me, because I saw the film at South by Southwest, like I had other than the trailer, I knew nothing about the film. So I was like very shocked by it. And like, I didn't know that it was supposed to be apolitical. Probably if I had seen it now, knowing sort of the discourse around it, I'd feel differently. But at the time, it was just like very shocking to be like, I don't know. That really threw me for a loop. But yeah, no, I think you guys have articulated those points very well.
Yeah, a lot of people are using that word apolitical when describing the film, and I certainly understand why. I don't know if I would call it apolitical given the overall landscape of what is depicted here. I think maybe to call it more neutral is a better way to put it, and neutral and apolitical are not necessarily the same thing. They don't always have to be. And to talk about the political side of things, the idea that he has California and Texas essentially joining forces here. I mean, that idea
Mhm.
already presents political ideas. Like that in and of itself is a political notion. And that could potentially be interesting. But I think, the film isn't really working when Alex Garland himself has to explain this to us in interviews. And there have
Yeah.
been a few interviews where he's had to do
Yeah.
this, where he was talking about this idea of political polarization and the idea of striving for neutrality, especially through the lens, no pun intended, of
Mhm.
photojournalism. I think that right there is a potential complement to everything that's working here. But you do present a political side, not picking a side, but you present a political side to this overall spectrum when you're having two states that don't agree with each other whatsoever coming together to overthrow a fascist president.
Mhm.
That's the way Alex Garland has put it. So by doing that, I think your argument and your intent begins to start collapsing on itself.
Yeah.
Because by doing it that way, you're already asking people to start picking sides in some way, and in a weird way, because of what California and Texas are doing. I think the movie is weirdly promoting insurrection. So it's just given the nature of that. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Again, maybe there's a fascinating thing there, but to something you said earlier, JD, calling the film maybe a little bit misguided in the way it's treating these ideas.
Yeah.
I like the overarching message of striving for neutrality, but there are these other components coming in that literally battle it, and I think
Yeah.
it starts to murk the waters more. And on
Yeah.
top of that, just not really liking it as a movie, I think just fueled my frustrations
Mhm.
with it further.
Now, what you're speaking to there is another major reason as to why I don't know what to make of this film, because in those interviews, you're right, Garland has said that Texas and California are allies in this film because he wanted to express the importance of two states who are nothing alike politically coming together to take down a fascist precedent. And that the film is about journalists doing old school reporting, and that by having any sort of political bias, that would dismantle its argument that polarization is bad. If that was indeed Garland's inspiration, the gap between intent and execution is enormous because none of that is in this film. I can appreciate the lack of exposition and handholding. I don't need to be spoon-fed, but there's
a difference
nothing
between
to suggest
difference between that and underdeveloped.
there's nothing to suggest that's why Texas and California are unifying in this film. And perhaps most importantly, this is where being apolitical is detrimental, because the lack of political cogency makes that unification not only feel false, again, there's no weight to it. By illuminating the political ethos of those two states, even if it's more obvious dramatically or thematically, it has more power. And additionally to that, why just California and Texas? A fascist president rises to power, and only two states are willing to put aside their political beliefs to fight back? By committing to just two states, the film inadvertently undermines its own argument.
Well, it kind of asks you to
because
take a side
that
then,
means,
right?
That means 48 other states didn't care to reach across the aisle or failed to do so, which implies that the country is still deeply polarized and divided regardless of the outcome of this war. Garland may have had affable intentions, but the execution of those ideas are flimsy at best.
Yep, because when Brendan, when you were making your point, what I kept thinking about is like, is the point of the movie that neutrality is impossible? But it doesn't do a very good job of even doing that, because at the end of the day, like, the states aren't completely neutral. So like, what is it even trying to say? Is murky is, I think, a great.
Yeah, and even by the end of the movie, which we won't spoil, I was left wondering, did anything that we just saw lead to anything new, or are we still in a similar point? Like, was the entire movie kind of futile and not really solving anything as far as attacking that notion of political polarization and that divide that exists? I think that's a great point as well, JD, that regardless of these two states that come together that are so different, what does that mean for everyone else? Because, and I think by painting it that way, by having such a heavy outweigh of other states who are not willing to play a part in this, it completely contradicts the idea that neutrality is something we should be striving for, because then it showcases by staying away from this, you're just as complicit to the problem. So like it's a movie that then seems to be presenting issues, but no potential solutions to those issues.
Yeah.
And not to say a movie like this needs solutions. I mean, Alex Garland, he's not a politician. I'm not necessarily going to trust him for issues around this at all. But
Yeah.
I feel like you have to offer at least some type of opinion, not pick a side. You don't have to pick a side, but at least some type of opinion to be able to create that through line. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of missing gaps that don't come together. And that's more or less what I felt like was happening here.
And again, this is where
agree.
I struggle, because as Brendan was saying, like, I felt that very much too at the end, where I was like, what is the point of this? Like, did any of the images that were captured, did they lead to anything? But then I'm thinking, well, isn't that kind of the point, that like war is often pointless and like people die and landmarks are destroyed and maybe nothing changes? But like, am I then giving the movie too much credit? Like, I don't know. And I
maybe that's just a byproduct of the situation, as opposed to, the credit going to Alex Garland in that regard.
Right.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think you have to at least dabble in why these states are choosing what they're choosing and committing to more of them, because this is a film essentially about Washington, D.C., this fascist president against two states.
Yeah.
Where is everyone else? Where does everyone else stand? I think that is important, because we're talking about millions of other people who are simply lost in the shuffle here. And to something you said earlier, Brennan, where I think this tethers to something you said, and I very much do agree with, and maybe this is a plot twist in the conversation, because again, the discourse wants to emphasize how apolitical this film is, but it's not. It's not apolitical. For one, it is firmly anti-fascist.
Yeah.
That is a definitive stand that the film takes, and
that is
not
a political stance. That is
not
a political
nothing.
stance.
We're told that the president, played by Nick Offerman here, has committed airstrikes against U.S. citizens. He is brazenly denying journalists any opportunity to tell the truth. There's that scene early on where Lee, Sammy, and Joel talk about how it's even suicide to go to Washington, D.C. There's another scene early on where we see that mobilized police forces are denying resources to civilians. The film clearly presents those as atrocities that make sense as to why people would fight back, why states would rebel against an oppressor. I also think about the sniper scene where the soldiers they come across have dyed hair and painted fingernails, which immediately evoke the trans and LGBTQ community. And while we don't know who they're shooting at, we do know that they're hiding in this giant, massive white manor that is indicative of wealth and privilege. It's not that far of a stretch to see through the symbolism there. Symbolism that isn't devoid of politics. And then there's the Jesse Plemons scene. And again, the film might not give us any real clarity on which team he plays for, but we do know that he's egregiously racist, and that his empathy only goes as far as those who agree with or represent his American ideologies. That's also not empty of politics. In fact, there are more deep-seated political angles that the film elicits regarding extremism that our friend Richard Newby does a phenomenal job of articulating in his Hollywood Reporter piece. I urge everyone to go and check that out. This film is not devoid of politics. Those images are there. It is not apolitical. Garland might not be choosing a side per se. He might be aiming for neutrality, but those politics are there. And I wish that the film was able to weave that into its premise more seamlessly, or at least give it weight. But because he doesn't give the premise of the film any time to manifest and to as to why any of this is happening. Where are the other states? A lot of that political subtext feels like fluff. Like it's just clouds. It's a fart in the wind. Like it doesn't feel like anything.
This is why my reaction when I first saw the movie was, that's it? Like, that was literally my reaction, was just simply, that's it, with a question mark. And admittedly, I did see this already hearing some of the discourse, so perhaps that was more on me, at least in the moment, and I'm willing to admit that. But even given the conversation here, I feel like it's proving my "that's it" response, in that the movie just feels so incomplete. It just feels kind of like, dare I say, a half-assed attempt at something provocative. And like I said, my opening thoughts, I like the kernels of those ideas. I think those kernels are very provocative. And I think if there was a through line there, there's a very interesting movie here. And I think even on paper, there is still a very interesting movie here. But as a movie, I just don't think it's realized in some ways. And, we talked about this earlier, and Shadan, I agree with your points on the screenplay as well. It feels like a first draft. Like, this really does feel like a first draft to me. It feels like a way to get from plot A to B before you really sit down and refine it to create something elusive out of this. And that's not what I got here.
So I have a question. Well, and I completely agree with you that I think in this case, the lack of context does scream underdeveloped to me, rather than let's just throw the audience in there. But I'm curious what you guys think of the fact that obviously Alex Garland is not American, and whether that is a pro or whether that's a con, because he fails to capture a lot of the nuances that maybe an American filmmaker would have been better to capitalize on and capture.
I think it's a pro, but I think it becomes a con given the final film that we got. I think the idea of an outsider coming in to portray a situation like this with a neutral lens, as he claims to, I think that idea makes sense. I think the problem is that he tries to go deeper and tries to understand our political divide, and tries to also create a world of what if, what's the worst scenario of that what if, and fails to understand that. So then it inadvertently becomes a con then. But I think the idea of having an outsider come in to do this is not necessarily a bad idea. So like him being chosen for this movie, or him choosing to do this in the first place, doesn't bother me. I'm a firm believer that anyone who is an outsider, whether it be politically or even culturally, if you're willing to put yourself in those other shoes and learn from that sense that you're portraying, that's always welcomed. And I'm just not sure if Garland did enough of the work to be dangerous with it. And that's what I got.
Yeah. I think what I appreciate about the film and Garland coming at this as an outsider is that the film isn't propaganda. And a lot of attempts at making this kind of movie could fall into those traps.
Sure.
So I do appreciate that he attempts to evoke questions through the imagery and the horror we see here in a neutral way. There's a scene where Lee says, I think somewhat early on, the objective of war photography is not to provide answers, but provide an unaltered image and let viewers ask the questions. As an outsider, that's clearly what Garland is trying to do. I just don't know how much weight those questions carry here because of the film's execution, as we're talking about. But fundamentally, I like that idea. I think it simply comes down to maybe not him being in tune with American politics, but knowing just enough to wrestle with them here, but in a way that only comes off as superficial. And I don't know, he's a smart guy, so I think that's an intentional choice. I don't think that's a British perspective per se. I think he's wanting to, as he said in his own words, avoid polarization.
Yeah.
And sadly, I think that approach is misguided because everything we see here is political in some way, whether it's intentional or not. I mean, I referenced a few moments earlier, the sniper scene, of course, the Jesse Plemons scene. There is there's political angles to those scenes. Is he aware of that? I don't know.
I
Honestly,
don't know. Yeah.
know. But to me, that's more indicative of his approach and the premise that he's trying to funnel it through than him being an outsider. Now, that could be part of it. I don't know, but
Yeah.
if I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, I think it's mostly an execution thing. Like I just don't think he came in with the wrong structure.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well-
and I'm sorry. Go ahead, JD. I was mostly just going to agree with that once again. That just to echo that having someone as an outsider could like sometimes a movie with a certain political or even social lens can benefit from being told by someone that maybe doesn't fully understand it yet. Because in some cases, then it could be someone that's willing to listen to something that's not part of their, I guess, ideology. And that's always a welcome thing. And like I said earlier, I feel like Alex Garland, I think he wants to know what he's doing. I think he wants to have an understanding of this world. I feel it's almost like he was rushed to make a movie. It's almost like what it felt like here, and that didn't give him enough time to really hone in on the overall landscape. If you're choosing to portray it this way, and I know it's a dystopian setting. It's not a sci-fi film, but it kind of is in a weird way as well. So like there is still a level of fiction that has to be addressed here, but I don't know. I think he missed the mark. I really do.
I do as well, and perhaps where he missed the mark the most actually circles back to what I argued in my opening thoughts regarding the film first and foremost being this ode to photojournalism. I think there's a fair question to ask about war journalism and if it can be neutral, if it can be apolitical. War journalism is inherently political. And I think we do see that in this film, even if it's not intentional on Garland's part. We learn quickly that Lee, even if she is a celebrated war photographer, she's lost all faith that her work can create lasting change. We don't know much about her outside of her work, but her identity is built around her jadedness. On the other hand, Joel lives for the thrill and is eager to see history firsthand. Sammy has been around a long time, and while he's more empathetic than Lee, he equally shares a healthy dose of cynicism, which is all in contrast to Jesse, who's young and inexperienced and all too willing to explore this volatile world of war journalism. As I talked about in my opening thoughts, it's impossible to separate these characters from the chaos they see around them. That is a direct result of political fallout. They are affected by what they see and the turmoil they experience at the hands of this war. And it's a very human response to recoil at the politics that made it a reality. The last line of this film, which I won't go into for spoilers, but what does Joel say there?
Yeah.
Again, out of context. Yeah, that'll do. That's what he says as we hear a gun go off. And you can sense his anger, you can sense his grief. There's almost a joy in what he witnesses there. It's just as much a political response as it is an emotional one. You simply can't witness atrocities of that scale and not react to the politics that rendered it possible. That may not have been the intent of the film, but I think that's honestly a big part of it.
Sure.
Something that I don't know if Garland is aware of. And if he is, he refuses to explore it.
I do wonder if some of those interesting ideas that do come through are by accident. I really do.
It makes me wonder because he does not examine that in this film, but we do see it. Like my reaction to Joel when he confronts that character and says that line, it felt like it was as he could, because he's responding by what he had witnessed, the death, the carnage, and not just from strangers, people he knew intimately, up close, personal. So there is a visceral, palpable anger in him in that moment. He is responding to the politics. That's why he's angry, because this political figure made that possible, made that happen. You can't separate those two things. So avoiding the politics, I do think is a little disingenuous.
Well, and
here.
maybe
But
that's
see-
or
yeah,
extremely disingenuous.
yeah. Go ahead,
I don't
Shadan.
think that anyone would genuinely respond that way. That felt very like the flippancy of him saying that just felt not real to me.
See,
Like I felt.
okay, interesting.
Go ahead. Yeah,
Well,
I don't
I
know.
was gonna say, like, I feel like that's how I would react. Like, for example, and again, I'm gonna do the Garland thing. I'm gonna avoid specific politics because I don't want to make anyone angry. But if I am in the middle of a conflict, and I don't care who the president is. I don't care who the president is. There's a conflict. I'm in the middle of it. If I'm out trying to survive. Now, again, with Joel, it's a little different because he's actively putting himself in the line of fire. But if I'm out and someone close to me that I'm with is shot and killed as a result of that conflict, I'm going to be angry. I don't care who the president is. And if I have an opportunity to confront him, I'm absolutely going to recoil and have that same kind of anger spout out of me. To me, that's the human response there. And I don't blame him for having that response. Where the depth of it lacks for me is that it doesn't, the only stand the film has is we are anti-fascism. Okay. Good for you. That's
so are a lot of people.
So are so there's nothing
Yeah.
inherently interesting. Like the human response, I totally empathize with. I would have that response. I think a lot of people would, but I don't think the film really earns it because there's no weight to it, if that makes sense. Because the politics of it are very thin.
Well, see, to me, it felt like all of the emotions were kind of muted, which I understand. I mean, I guess that's the point is like they've been journalists for a long time, so they've become jaded. So I guess your emotions do become muted. But I feel like that was the climax of the film, or, and it just felt like very much like a nothing, like I feel like if I was in Joel's situation, I would be much angrier. I would like, this is the confrontation that he's been waiting for all this time. And it just felt like,
And
Now,
maybe
that's an
maybe-
argument I could buy. Like he should have been more cathartic.
Well,
Like, I
maybe he
totally
doesn't
buy
know
that.
how to because they've been striving for such neutrality for so long. It's such a new
That's true.
experience to deal with it that way. And something you had said earlier, Shadan, that I think is a great point is maybe this idea of neutrality is actually impossible within this space. And I think that's what makes it kind of interesting, the polarity between Joel, that's his character, Joel and Jesse, played by Kaylee Spaney, who has somewhat of an opposite arc, I'll simply say without getting into spoilers. I think that polarity is also somewhat interesting, maybe indirectly fueling the polarity that exists politically that we were talking about as well. But I do think that question of neutrality being even possible is an interesting one. So perhaps Joel is just he's going through such shock that it becomes kind of numbing in the moment. So I don't know. Like I guess that's my only way of defending it, even if at the same time, as a viewer engaging this as a piece of drama, I'm also with you, Shadan, where I'm thinking, like, shouldn't I be more stimulated by this? Like I'm not. Like I
Well,
think from go ahead,
maybe
JD.
for me, that's where the performances come into play because I really loved Kirsten Dunst's stoicism here. And
Yeah.
there's something about, I don't know. I tend to love those kinds of performances, generally speaking. And the vacancy that she demonstrates, I think, is incredible because it is indicative of how empty she feels because her work has been futile. And there's glimpses we see throughout the film of her doing this work previously. And I think she even speaks to it in a scene with Jesse, how she got into this line of work to prevent America from committing these same atrocities only for them to indulge in it anyway. So her whole career, her whole life, her legacy means nothing, absolutely nothing. So that jadedness that comes out in her performance, I think, is fantastic, where you contrast that with Joel, who is eager to get into the line of fire, but that is deconstructed as the film goes, again, without getting into spoilers, but he witnesses some death firsthand that does kind of mitigate that eagerness. And I think it's in Mora's performance that I guess that anger and that grief that he displays there. And it's one little line that he says at the end of the film. Artistically, I do appreciate the way he goes about it, because even though I think in a more realistic setting, I agree with Shadan, that person would be much more cathartic and perhaps volatile in that situation. But artistically, I love that Mora is much more subtle with it. So I do love that approach from a performance standpoint. But I still think he gives it a bite. Like, there's a bitterness to the way he delivers that dialogue that I very much responded to. And Kaylee Spaney's really great. She has the reversal arc that you're saying there, Brendan. There's actions the character takes that I find maybe questionable, dramatically speaking, but Spaney I think is also very good. So like I think more so than what's there on the page, the performances make that work for me emotionally speaking.
Yeah, I think every performance here was good enough. But I think that's less on the actors themselves and more so on Alex Garland as a director making choices that might undercut the drama even further. I think there are seeds of really great performances trying to come through, but then Alex Garland will do something with like a weird editing choice or a piece of soundtrack, some weird needle drop that just kind of stifles the performance from really coming through for me. And there's also some of this dialogue that we talked about earlier feeling kind of stilted and on the nose that maybe undersold these performances even further, because I think all of these people are great actors. And I think I could sense, okay, there's great work trying to come through here. And I was reaching for it, but then something would happen where I just, I'm not getting it. I'm not getting it. And I think and this is my way of saying, I don't think the performances are the problem if I was feeling a little bit distant from it. I think it's more so on Alex Garland, the director, making certain choices that just stifle them a little bit.
Okay. See, that's interesting. I very much had the antithetical response to that. Because for me, where Garland stifles this film is on the thematic side of it and some of the dramatic side. There is tension throughout the film. I mean, that whole Jesse Plemons scene, I do think is
I don't
quite
agree.
foreboding.
I don't agree. Like every action that Jesse Plemons takes, he says something. It's like, oh, he's going to do this. Yep, he did that. It's like, oh, he's going to do this. Yep, he did that. It's like, it's so paint by numbers to me. And there was rarely ever a moment where I found myself shocked or even stimulated by what was on the screen. I think the cinematography is merely fine. There's no shot in this movie that really wowed me. And I think the soundtrack itself has a weird sense of irony to it, which I at least appreciated. But otherwise, it just didn't really hit me in that regard.
Yeah, I can't go that far. I just can't. Like I think the performances are very good. I really do. I did not find them stilted. The dialogue I don't necessarily disagree with, but I think structurally, the way he presents these characters, there's enough information for us to glean as to who they are. And as I noted in my opening thoughts, the film is primarily dedicated to exploring these characters in this setting. We very rarely go outside of the characters to explore the world. For as wide-scaled as this conflict is, it actually feels really small. Again, there's no cogency to the world Garland builds because he wants to avoid polarization. And a byproduct of that is that its love letter to war photography lacks potency for all the reasons we've been talking about. But I did find some poignancy here because of the performances on their own terms, which I do think have something of merit here. I did feel Mora's performance there in the end. Or his reaction that he does actually have one cathartic outburst when there's a death that we see unfold on screen. Like I feel
and
that
it's blocked
moment.
by music, and I was like, I'm reaching for it, but there's a soundtrack blocking it for me. It's like I can't get there. I just couldn't get there.
I still felt the performance. Garland
okay.
certainly undermines himself in other areas, as we've talked about, but on its own terms, I like the performance. I like the way he says that line of dialogue, as noted earlier. I love the vacancy in Dunstan's performance. I have no issue with that, and I also can't go as far as to say that the cinematography is like. There's some moments in this film. I called out some of them in my opening thoughts that I think genuinely are great. And I think they are meant to be a little poetic in some regard. Now, the special effects of this film are utterly garbage. And maybe we can talk about that. Terrible. absolutely terrible. But I think when the photography needs to be great, I think it is. Aside from that, like the action itself is derivative. It's fine,
Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
The Plemons scene I think does work for me, but is it? It's certainly not what's there on the page. I don't. I agree with you. Everything he does is a surprise. But I think the performances are effective.
I'm
They
glad
work
you
for me.
brought up the word derivative because I've been kind of waiting this whole podcast. I think there is and Brendan, I hope it makes you feel better that I agree with a lot of what you said because there
Okay.
are moments that completely took me out of the film. I mean, I watched it with a friend, and this is nitpicky, but I watched it with a friend. And there's this point where this guy, he comes out in like a red Hawaiian shirt, but he's trying to hide. And we're like, why would you wear a red Hawaiian shirt in the middle of a war? I mean, it was just distracting.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway,
Yeah.
but I do think a lot of it does feel derivative. I mean, I love Jesse Plemons because of the performance, but that sort of like cartoonish villain. And even like, again, with this whole like ode to journalists, like there's a lot of films that do that better. And the war action sequence, it's like it's all things that we've seen before. And to bring it back to your earlier point, I think it's the concept that is what is engaging.
It's a problem here. It's a problem.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and not the actual execution. And then a lot of the images, I'm curious if you guys feel this way. I felt like it was shock value for the sake of shock value. Which is why I couldn't really connect. Like in the beginning, when they're kind of showing the sequences of violence, again, that's all things that I've seen before. It didn't feel new, where I could feel like, wow, this is really happening in my backyard type thing. It felt like
Yeah.
any war movie would show that. And to the point of the visual effects, JD, one of the moments in the film that I just found kind of insulting and disgusting is when they light a man of color on fire, but the fire looked terrible. And I felt like the only reason you're going to do that is to make people get them shocked and piss them off and make them feel uncomfortable. But it just didn't land at all because I just could see through it so clearly. And I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of the imagery felt that way for me. Even, I mean, at some point there's like a landmark that blows up or something. And I was like, okay, like you blew up a landmark just to show me Washington being destroyed. Cool.
And it makes me think, like, is the shock value not delivering the shock part of the point, because it's trying to showcase how lacking that shock will still stimulate this kind of divisiveness and a response from this movie. But again, that gets back to something I said earlier, that a movie shouldn't be deliberately lesser in that regard in order to prove a point. But I'm with you that there are scenes there that are very much intended to be shocking, whether it be shock value for shock value's sake. I don't know. I think that's, up for debate, but I'm with you in the sense that I never really was shocked by them. And maybe it's because I was able to see through them the same way that you were, Shadan, as you were saying very eloquently there. Or it could just be there are certain things that Alex Garland is doing as a filmmaker that I think just stifle a lot of these things. There was a sequence later on in the movie, I think it was referenced by you, JD, I'm not really sure, but it involves the characters in this car driving through a fiery, woodsy landscape. And Sammy
I
here,
mentioned that in my opening thoughts.
played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, is kind of reaching out for it. I thought that scene was laughably cheesy. That did not work for me at all. And maybe it's because tonally it just felt so disconnected from some of the other things that we were seeing. But I think it's also weirdly like the song choice. He's utilizing Breaker's Roar by Sturgill Simpson. And because of that, that's a scene that should work for me. I'm a huge Sturgill Simpson fan. I love that tune that he's referencing there. And yet I kept sitting there thinking, like, this just seems odd. In the context of the movie, the flow of it, the slow motion aspect of it too, just felt very dramatically forced in an almost like Hallmark kind of way. And this is why I think as a filmmaking experience, this really left me cold. And I like Alex Garland as a filmmaker. I love his first two films as a director. Actually, if you want to count three, I mean, we might as well throw Dredd into that. Carl Urban says he directed Dredd anyway, so I'll actually throw that in there as well. I think that's a really fascinating movie too. But specifically, Ex Machina and Annihilation have this artfulness that's on screen visually. And I felt like I was looking for that all the time here and not always getting it.
I think it's interesting that we're all mixed on this, but for like completely different reasons.
That's the point. That's the point.
I think it's hilarious because that moment with Sammy, as I mentioned earlier, it didn't bother me. Certainly not for the reasons you're talking about, because that was like the 5th time in the movie where that had happened. Like this whole movie at its core was trying to be an ode to photojournalism. And there are several times, 4, 5, at least times where Garland slows down, takes us out of the action to emphasize these specific characters, our central group, admiring the carnage around them. Whether it be that, I also quite vividly think of Lee laying in the grass, admiring flowers as she's literally hiding from sniper gunfire.
Yeah,
like,
I love the idea.
So many times
I love the idea.
that happens throughout the film. So like, I didn't feel the way you did because Garland had already laid the groundwork for that so many times previously.
But there's subtlety in those prior scenes. There's no visual subtlety in the Sammy scene.
I guess I don't agree with that because to Shadan's point, lighting a man on fire is not subtle. There's absolutely nothing subtle about that at all.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about subtlety versus non-subtlety in the moments of tranquility amidst the gunfire.
Yeah.
So like those moments of tranquility that you're talking about, I think have subtlety until the moment with Sammy reaching out. And I was like, okay, that's just corny as hell.
Gotcha.
That just, yeah. So
okay,
like, there's that disconnect in those specific moments that I'm referencing there.
Okay. And again, we'll disagree there because I don't find any of it subtle at all.
Okay.
But I do think there's purpose to it because, again, I think that's what the film is trying to be.
I'm with you.
You know, that moment of the man being set on fire is meant to evoke Lee's legacy of, hey, I've captured this thing that's really awful. We should not do that ourselves. She speaks to that. That's what she's saying in the voiceover as we get that image. So there is dramatic purpose to it. There's thematic purpose to it. Does the film fully realize that image and the ideas that come from it? No, for a lot of the reasons we've already been talking about. So like, to me, that's more of the, like, I don't have as much of an issue with craft, although the effects are terrible. I have much more of an issue of why he's funneling this film the way that he does.
Yeah.
And avoiding the politics of it, I think is the wrong move because inherently everything we see here, not everything, but a lot of the things we see here are political in nature, or at least there's a political angle to what we see, but Garland pretends that there isn't. And
unless that's the point,
that approach,
unless it's the point that apolitical is not possible. And again,
I don't think it is, because that's not what he said in the interviews.
Is that part of the, is that part of the movie? Is he just trying to misdirect us?
Maybe. I don't know.
Am I giving him too much credit? I think I am, but it makes me wonder if there's a lot of misdirect happening behind the scenes and post-release, as opposed to just but the movie should be the only thing doing the work. That's the point we're also trying to make here. If the movie is not the thing doing the work for us, then there's a problem with the movie. And I feel like that could be the case here. If a director has to be on camera explaining things to us, and if a movie like this is meant to provoke a response, and I feel like it's us as people that are really the source of that response, as opposed to the film itself, then I think the film is problematic in doing so. I actually think the film pulls its punches quite a bit. So any type of like stimulant that's trying to provoke us to have a conversation about it, I really don't think it's the film. I think some people are ready to have a conversation about this movie before even seeing the movie. It's kind of like the Joker thing, right? I feel like this almost falls into a similar camp as that movie as far as what it does to provoke a conversation out of us. So I'm not sure if I can give credit to the movie for doing that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Also, for those watching on YouTube, I have entered a cave because my computer was about to die. So I had to unplug my light and plug in my computer.
I love the green. So, I really do.
It's very green in the background now.
The aliens have come for JD.
Do that more often. Do that more often.
The fascist aliens have come for JD.
I do like it, but now you can't. Well, maybe people shouldn't see my face.
You know what? You should save that. You should save that specific look for certain reviews that we do. If there's meant to be like an ominousness that we're going to provoke, so it's
You can't
We-
see me. I'm John Cena, but it's very green in the background.
No, you should do that for your horror films, or
The
like the
horror film,
Wicked.
yeah.
The Wicked episode should be.
Especially Wicked. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
oh, please don't do it for Wicked. Do something odd, like do Pink or something. Just to be,
As we wind down here, I actually want to ask you guys something about this. Okay. And I'm curious, especially based off of this conversation, we've all kind of come at this a little differently. But I think, I want to circle back to Richard Newby's piece in the Hollywood Reporter, because he says something that I do think is really interesting, where he talks about how the film evokes modern discourse through its images and why people find themselves uncomfortable with it, and so some of the things that Garland includes here. So let me read this, and then I'm going to ask you guys your thoughts on it. So, quote, "The scenes in this film and supporting characters reflect so much of our modern day political discourse, which is populated by people who come for the necks of their own allies for not entirely subscribing to the most extreme, most perfect form of their ideology. We see these extremes every day, from the serious to the silly. Conservatives who want gun control criticized by right-wing extremists who give their children guns for Christmas. Liberals who reject other liberals because they weren't as vocal about one social injustice as they were for another. And grifters who make audacious claims and promise the truth for a monthly fee. More distressingly, we're seeing horseshoe theory in action, with supposed liberals saying they'll vote for Trump after being incensed by Biden's support for Israel against Palestine, or that they won't vote at all, as if any such choice allows them a moral high ground that absolves them of any further suffering people will endure. We form our personalities around these ideologies and become so enmeshed in them that we start to lose sight of what we stand for and who our allies and enemies really are, until it all dissolves into chaos." End quote. Now, we don't have to get into those specific politics, but what I think is interesting there, the argument that he's making, because to something you said earlier, Brendan, as far as how people are responding to this film
yeah.
in a way that might be a little surprising, but it's something that I think we see on social media all the time in terms of, the polarization that we see in this film, trying to cut through that. Now, it doesn't, the film fails in that for a lot of the reasons we're talking about, but I thought that was such a specific perspective that I hadn't really seen anywhere else regarding the conversation around this film. It might be out there, but I've only really seen this from Richard. And I think given what we see in this film and its attempts at neutrality, and maybe both sides of the aisle struggling to find that in the discourse with this film, I'm curious what you guys think of that point of view here.
I think it's a really interesting point of view, and this is another reason why I just love Richard Newby as a writer and overall interpreter when it comes to art, right? Is that he is someone that is willing to not necessarily write for both ends of the spectrum, but he's willing to listen, and he's willing to offer potential viewpoints in both of those sides. And he's more or less doing that here. I just don't know if the film itself is kind of interested in that. I think I think if anything, he's more so writing about the response that the movie has been getting and the divisiveness that has resulted because of it, and where that source is coming from. And if anything, that polarization is always going to be there, regardless if a film provokes it or if we're just there to keep provoking it ourselves. And I think that's what makes it interesting, is he's commenting on something that is already there. It's going to be there for a while, and sometimes a little pinprick is able to provoke it even further. and I find it interesting in that regard, just commenting on the overall sensitivity of its existence. And if he was able to find that in this movie, then I'm so glad he did. I wish I was able to sense it in the movie as well, because I think that's a very interesting argument. And I think it is one that Alex Garland is hoping to achieve here. given that neutrality we've been talking about. I just don't know if he succeeds in that regard, but I'm glad Richard Newby is writing about it in that way to convey it, because I think what he's talking about is something we need to hear.
I completely agree with you, Brendan. I think it's a great point that he's making. I probably agree with most, if not all of it, but it feels like divorced from the actual movie that I saw. Like, I feel like you could put like Succession at the beginning of that paragraph or whatever, and it would be the same thing. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't feel specific to Civil War. It just feels like our current like political landscape. I don't think that Civil War has actually contributed to it at all. I think, to your earlier point, like, maybe we're all on edge and anything will set us off into these discussions, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the movie.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because I echo you guys in that sentiment. Like, I love what Richard is aiming for there.
Yeah.
I deeply wanted to see that in the film. And I really did wrestle with this, because coming out of the film, there were elements that I did appreciate, that I still do appreciate on some level, as I argued here, but I just don't see it in the film as much, because Garland is, he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. And I think as a result, both the politics of it, or again, the lack thereof, but it's certainly there, and whatever he's trying to do as this being an ode to journalism, I think both of those things suffer quite a bit.
Yeah.
And really our biggest disparity in that between myself and you guys is I think the performances do save that a little bit. Or it's the inadvertent elements of the film that I do kind of find interesting, such as, the sniper scene, as we mentioned earlier, or that moment with the police and them not letting civilians have access to resources. Like there's political angles of the film that I do think add interesting nuance to this film. I just don't think it's intentional. Like I
think it's
or at least I question it.
Like,
you know what I mean? Because every time those things come up, Garland refuses to examine it or at least give it weight.
Yeah.
There might be one or two moments where I felt it, but most of the time
Well, that's the thing.
It feels divorced.
So I came into this very confused, as I tried to not so eloquently explain. And the only thing I can think of sort of as we wrap is, I think it comes down to this question of like, how much credit am I willing to give this movie and willing to give Garland, right? Because it's like, I could read all these deeper meanings into it, but like, do I want to? You know what I mean? Because so much of it
that's
does.
I feel like if you're going to read deeper meanings into the movie, it's going to be similar to what Richard wrote about, and that it's going to be more of an analysis on our sociopolitical divide in general, not really about the movie. And I have to say, and this is something I'm going to weirdly admit to, it's something I don't ever admit to because I've never really done this before. I always like to go into a movie with an open mind and a completely clean slate. But perhaps part of my issue too is I did see this movie too late. This is a movie I would have loved to have seen before knowing what this discourse was, because I kind of went into the movie practicing what I was hoping to get out of it, which was exactly what Richard Newby was writing about. That's what I was hoping to get from this movie, is how neutrality is something that could actually find both ends of this spectrum to look at both sides. And like that over idea that he's talking about, I think is very fascinating. I was hoping to get it from this movie. So I kind of went in with the mentality that that's what I was going to try and get. And then thinking that, okay, if people don't like the messaging here, they're projecting their own political beliefs into it and they're conflating their political beliefs with it. And that's part of the problem. And I walked out of the movie thinking, I got none of that. I don't know if I don't feel changed at all by this movie.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm walking out of it in the exact same place I was walking in. I wasn't provoked. I wasn't stimulated intellectually, even if I like the ideas of what it's going for. And a movie with this kind of concept, this kind of high political concept, I should feel challenged in a way. Like, it doesn't even need to be something I agree with. I actually like when I see a movie and I don't agree with its messaging because I want to try and think of it from that perspective. But I took nothing away from this. I feel like that's the worst thing to say about a movie like this.
And
Well,
I felt like I just left with frustration that I still feel. And again, it's like, is that the point, that we're supposed to feel frustrated with where we are right now? I don't
maybe.
know. I
Yeah.
just feel like a different filmmaker, again, maybe would have added more nuance to
A
these.
12-year-old could say that same thing and get the same theme out of it.
Yeah, and I don't think Garland has helped himself with these interviews, which is why I wanted to devote a whole
Yeah.
section of this conversation to it, because if what he was trying to do, if the intent was to demonstrate that being apolitical is impossible, then I'd say the film succeeded heavily in that. But everything that he said, at least recently, is counterintuitive to that
It
idea.
is, yeah.
And to something you said earlier, Shadan, that I think is actually really fascinating, because not every time, but a lot of the times, especially when we're doing these reviews and having these conversations, I absolutely do everything I can to engage with the art and wrestle with how I feel about it.
Yeah.
But at what point do you draw a line if the film isn't doing that?
Yeah.
And this is a film
Yeah.
that it's not engaging with its assertions, and I honestly don't know how much it wrestled with writing out its politics. Because again, I go back to thinking about the whole California, Texas of it all.
Yeah.
By including that and ignoring 48 other states, it implies a whole slew of other issues that this film does not address, that I think is important and that the film should have brought up at the very least.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't. And to me, that's a lack of intention, a lack of wrestling with this. So to Shadan's point, if you see this and you walk away feeling the way we do, and you're like, no, I'm not engaging with that, I'm not wrestling with that, I honestly can't blame you. Because I don't know if the film did any of that. You know what I mean? And maybe that's being a little myopic on my end. Maybe that's a little disingenuous for me to say, but
Alex
I don't know.
Garland,
it
where
just
art
feels like
thou?
there's a lot missing here.
Alex, where art thou? Where have you been since 2019?
I know. It is
I
disappointing. 'Cause-
think
yeah.
his interviews, I think a publicist told him that people are upset that the film isn't maybe taking more of a political stance. So his interviews are trying to explain that and like
That's a good point.
retroactively fix
Yeah.
things. And I
That's
think
a
it's
good
actually
point.
digging him into more of a hole.
I agree.
That would
And
make so much sense. Honestly.
I agree.
That is a great
Yeah.
point, Shadan.
I think that's exactly what's happening, and you nailed it. He's only making things worse. Because I certainly had my issues with the film before or after seeing it. And then once he made those remarks, everything that I thought about this film kind of reverted against itself. Like I had a whole slew of other problems now. Like this conversation would have been very different from my end if he had not made those remarks. So I don't know. Maybe this is a testament that artists should just let the work speak for itself. Like you don't have to explain your intentions, I guess. But
I mean,
Well,
this
like
is what
stick to your conventions. Like if that's the movie you
Yeah.
wanted to make, you made it. Great. You don't need to go back and try to make it something that it's not.
I mean, yeah,
Then that
Garland,
makes it more obvious that it's not what you.
I mean,
Yeah.
Alex Garland, he's certainly not Stanley Kubrick, but there's something that made Stanley Kubrick's work so great is that he never felt the need to handhold or explain his films to you. That was what was so fascinating about it. Alex Garland is clearly a different filmmaker, but yeah, you're right, JD, and you're right, Shadan. It's just let the work be its own thing. Like if his publicist is saying he has to do that, then I feel like that's in some ways that would mean the movie's kind of working, right?
Mhm.
Alex Garland's response should have been, well, if it's making people upset, let them talk it out, let them deal with it. Like that's kind of the intent I'm trying to hope for here. And if he is truly talking about this because he is forced to, then it shows how cowardice he might be. And that's really unfortunate.
And it's just so that, like, to me, that is such an outlier in his filmography. You know, you think of something like Ex Machina, which has so much to it. He didn't explain anything with that film. That was not hand-holding by any stretch of the imagination. Annihilation is even more ambitious and weird. And again, as far as I know, he's not like, here's here's what happens in it. Like the final scene of Annihilation, this is what it is. No, like he's not. He's not talking about it in that way. Like Men was polarized, and I don't think he's out there trying to explain himself. Like I don't. Maybe it's because A24 is trying to make these big movies.
I think they're trying to commercialize this one. Yeah.
Well, okay, and this is where I wanted to ask you guys, because clearly I think this is an A24 thing. I mean, Civil War has the highest opening ever for an A24 film, so clearly it worked, but it seems like they're moving in a direction where they want to do like these like bigger tentpole films that are still quote unquote artsy. That leads down a whole like other interesting avenue of what is the future of A24 going to be. If this is A24 doing this, what does this say about the future of cinema in general? But that is just very interesting to me too. It adds a whole nother layer of like, whatever to this whole conversation.
Absolutely right.
Perhaps this was just A24 who, yes, wants to get more into bigger films to make their money back in many ways. They've even talked about getting into IP a little bit. And we talked about this before, GD. I don't mind A24 playing that game. I think they make quality films, and I'd like to see them make their money back. I don't mind that because their artfulness, I would love to see in bigger productions. But I'm sometimes thinking now, are they only doing this first now with Civil War because they want to get people talking and they want to get people noticing the A24 logo? So now when they do this again, people will recognize the A24 logo and get them interested in it. So is Civil War just a marketing ploy for A24 in that regard?
It could. And you know whose fault this is? This isn't Alex Garland's fault.
No.
This is the Daniels' fault. This is the fault of Everything Everywhere All at Once, because those studio execs were sitting in their comfy chairs in their office, and they said, that movie made how much money? 143 million. We made 104. I want more of that. How do we get more of that?
Yeah.
Civil War. That day. Born that day, shot 2 days later. So it's the Daniels we have to blame for this.
Oh, I still like that movie, though. I'm not going to be one of those people that hates the movie now for setting a bad trend, but I still like that movie.
I mean, when you make $143 million, and by A24 standards, that's like Avatar money for them, right? Like,
oh yeah, it's the same spectrum, just at a different scale.
Exactly.
Yeah, but
so
when
they're
that
like,
happens,
yes, I want more of
listen.
that green, please.
People notice.
Yeah. At any rate, all joking aside, I think Shadan nailed it. I think that's exactly the problem here. So
yeah, absolutely.
At any rate, do you guys have any final thoughts? I think we've pretty much talked it through.
I just want to say now I'm depressed because I'm thinking like, so Civil War's greatest legacy is going to be that now we're going to have more of these films that try to poke divisiveness on purpose to make money like that. And then when the art isn't behind it, you know what I mean? Like that just seems so depressing. So thanks, JG.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
All I'll do is hope that if A24 is going to do this more often, it's not going to be a film like this that provokes this kind of response. It's just using this initial response for this movie to get people to notice A24 in general. So that if that way, if they do something big and grand next, maybe it's another Everything Everywhere All at Once. And if it works in that regard, then I'll say, okay, maybe Civil War's placement in cinematic history had a purpose. Doesn't mean I have to like the product, but I can at least appreciate its trajectory, or at least the trajectory it helps set cinematically speaking. But I will say, just as far as Alex Garland is concerned, I would love to see him get back to something small scale. Annihilation is slowly becoming my favorite film of his, and I think it is because of the weirdness. And maybe that film also had the benefit of being based on a book. It was not it was not an original screenplay, so he had something to work with and to reinterpret himself. And I think that's what maybe did that film even more favors. And I actually read the book Annihilation that it's based on, and I think the movie's better, which doesn't happen very often.
I agree.
Yeah, I really do. So I, between that and Ex Machina, I really miss that guy. I really do.
Well, since A24 is getting into the IP game, be on the lookout for Annihilation 2, a new Annihilation coming.
Well, there is a sequel to Annihilation. Yeah,
the book is part of a trilogy. Yeah. So let's do.
Well, there you go. I had no idea. I stumbled on to some gold there. If you're listening, Alex Garland, you're welcome.
I would be excited for that, I have to say.
If
I mean,
there's-
I said at the beginning, like Alex Garland is one of those filmmakers where I will watch anything he makes, and Civil War has not changed that. Like, I'm looking forward
Yeah.
to seeing what he does next, whether it's
Same.
big or small.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
Yep.
same. I love him as a filmmaker. Ex Machina is great. I've loved a lot of his other work. I didn't hate Men as much as others did.
I have to rewatch that one. I've seen it once and I didn't have a very good reaction to it, but I'm
Yeah.
curious to give it another go.
Yeah, I thought it was fine. It was certainly a step down, but I didn't think it was terrible.
Okay.
Civil War is by far his worst film to date, as far as I'm concerned. And I do think it's misguided for all the reasons we talked about. If there's any consolation to what we just talked about regarding the legacy of Civil War, so far the film has only made $25 million at the box office. Its budget is reported to be $50 million, so it has some work to do. Now, you know, Shadan, you noted that it was the biggest opening for A24 to this point, but I don't think this has the same legs that Everything Everywhere All at Once did. So I don't think this will even come close to that when it's all said and done.
no.
Although who knows, it still has yet to really open overseas, and Norway might surprise us and just slobber all over this film. Who knows? They might eat it up. Denmark is going to love Civil War. I don't know. I don't know what the international release is going to do. But this film has some work to do to make back its money, and it might end up being way more disappointing for A24 than its initial opening weekend here in the States suggests. And if so, that might make them rethink their approach here. I mean, they're still going to aim for these big tentpole movies or IP, however that works under their ethos, but it might make them rethink their approach. And I don't know, hopefully that means in the future we avoid what we got here with Civil War anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to like this movie. I really did. I think there's a kernel of a provocative idea here. And I just wish it was realized.
Yeah, focus on the other 48 states. I want to know where Michigan fits in all this. Because they wouldn't be a loyalist.
Pennsylvania.
I tell you that
You're
much.
about that as
They
well.
would not be a loyalist.
I mean, they did talk
Anyway.
about Colorado and Missouri, or was it Missouri? Or they talked about some farm state, loose term, farm states, at least in context to some of these characters' history. But that doesn't really get by with the other 46 then, right? Like it doesn't.
What
cover
type
the
of
surface.
American are you, Brendan?
I guess
at
I'm the
any
one
rate.
that doesn't partake in anything.
With all of that said, thanks, Shadan, for being here. This was a lot of fun. It was a pleasure to
Thank
have
you
back.
for having me and giving me an avenue to talk through and sort of organize my thoughts. Again, I don't know
For
how
sure.
successful I was, but I appreciate
good.
it.
Sometimes you just got to talk it out. A good therapy
This
session.
is,
That's what this is all
exactly. Movie therapy. Civil War has sent me to therapy.
about. Exactly. Absolutely.
Oh, maybe we should get our
love that.
accreditation to become therapists now.
Yeah, that's what it is. Movies is therapy.
Yeah. There you go.
Shadan, tell us, where can we find your work? Where can we find you on social media, my friend?
I at Shadan Larki everywhere and co-hosting Chasing the Gold, and we have a lot of really exciting things coming up. So please, and it's on the same In Session Film feed. You don't need to go anywhere, but I hope you check out our podcast, send us ideas, rate, review, all that good stuff. So that's just such a wonderful opportunity, and we're excited to really dig into this next season, which is already underway. Weirdly,
Yeah.
It starts the day it ends.
Yeah. Dave over at the website at insessionfilm.com has really made it a priority and he's just gone full force into it already.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's been
he
really
has.
great to see.
Yeah.
So and of course Shadan is following and all of that. So there's going to be some great stuff on the podcast side as well as on the website.
It's
So be
great
sure
work.
to subscribe to the show as she stated. Going to be a lot of fun. Be sure to follow her on social media as well. Again, really do appreciate it. And if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please let us know. Leave a comment on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Be sure to rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That really helps out the show as well. And I believe that is it. Do you guys have any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
JD, go green or go home every time.
Green, exactly.
I like it.
Exactly. If I would have worn my green in session film shirt, I just would have blended it in the background, and I'd just be a floating head here.
Turn into a green screen.
Be...
I love this idea.
That'll be for the next episode. Next week's reviews. That'll be
for a very specific visual effects related episode.
Yeah, which part of JD is going to disappear next?
Yeah, that'll be a running gag throughout the year. So.
I love it.
Yeah. At any rate, Shadan, any final thought before we get out of here?
Oh, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. No, appreciate you being here. Civil War, a little bit disappointing, but still curious for Alex Garland. Still going to be open-minded.
Absolutely.
We'll see what he has coming down the pipeline next. Maybe Annihilation 2. Who knows? At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. How disappointing.